Hi, I'm Kenneth LaRue, and this is a training program on 3ds Max Release 5, the newest release of Discrete's 3D animation program. This training lesson, these lessons that you're about to watch, are designed to teach you the concept and creation process of 3D animation within 3ds Max 5. 3ds Max, what do you do with it? How do you work in it? First thing you do is you model your shapes. You model your objects by either using 2D splines or 3D geometry. And you can alter your geometry at a sub-selection level, or you can apply modifiers to it to alter and get to the final shape that you're trying to create. And then you'll use the material editor, where you create materials, either being a color with certain characteristics, or you can apply maps to your materials, such as wood or marble, to give it a real-world look. You add lights in the scene to illuminate the scene. You can also add a camera or cameras to control the rendered view of the scene. And once your animation is done, once you've animated it, you can then render out your scene. We're going to cover all these features and all the different things that you need to learn about this program, including some of the great new features in this Release 5, and there really are some great improvements. We'll start out with the interface. Now, the interface is totally customizable, and all the way down to the icon that you see on the screen. We will be using the default 3ds Max 5 interface throughout these lessons. Once you learn the program, once you feel totally comfortable with the program, you can then customize your interface to fit your need or your job that you're working on. These lessons are interactive in design, and what I mean by that is, for you to benefit the most, I believe you should be following along on your computer while watching these lessons and doing whatever you're seeing or whatever you're learning. This way you're learning not only by seeing but also by doing. And if the lesson gets ahead of you, if you didn't understand something or you want to really practice something, stop the playback, practice it. Do it over again until you feel totally comfortable with it. And then move on and then go on to the next lesson. All right, well, ready to start? Enough of me talking. Let's take a look at the interface and some of the preferences of 3ds Max 5 now. Okay, I'm going to double click on the 3ds Max icon on my desktop to open up the program. I did this because I want you to notice the splash screen. It's showing me the hotkeys that are available for the program. Now, this is a new feature, and it's a simple feature, yes, but it's a very powerful one because as you are opening your program, if you're paying attention, you can actually learn the hotkeys. Each time you open the program, a different set of hotkeys will be displayed. Like I said, it's very cool and it's simple, but you can also access the splash screen from within inside the program, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. For right now, 3ds Max opens, and we have a standard Windows menu bar along the top. We have pull-down menus that allow us to access a variety of different commands and actions, and you'll find some commands have flyouts with further options. As with most high-end 3D animation programs, you can achieve the same task or command from a variety of different places. We'll discuss the command panel in just a second, but that's this panel over here docked on the right. By default, it's at the Create mode of Standard Primitives. And you can see we have a variety of buttons to create geometry, such as a box, a cone, or a sphere. Let's go back over to our drop-down menu and go to the Create menu, and you'll see our top choice, the top flyout, is Standard Primitives. And then in this flyout, you see here's how we create a box or a cone, and so on, same way that we had on the command panel. Now, the main toolbar, by default, is under our menu bar. Let me also first point out that my screen resolution is set to 800 by 600, so these icons and buttons are as large as possible for you to see on your telephone screen. This is definitely not a recommended screen resolution for 3ds Max 5. But you'll see along the toolbar, there are many different buttons and icons on this main toolbar, such things as the transformation tools, the selection tools, the render tools, the reference coordinate systems, and because of my resolution, and maybe yours too, depending upon what you have it set at, you might not be able to see every single tool that's on this toolbar. And when that happens, you'll see a hand appear in an empty space of the toolbar, which allows me to scroll across to view any icons or tools that are not visible, dependent upon the screen resolution. Now, if you've used an earlier version of 3ds Max, you might notice some differences on the toolbar. There are some buttons that have been moved around, and there are some new buttons too. Example, the snap controls and the keyboard shortcut override button have been moved to the main toolbar. They used to be on the bottom in the previous releases. You'll also notice a new button to access the new name selection set dialog box. And the axis constraints by default are no longer on the main toolbar. They are on their own toolbar, separate toolbar that you can access by right-clicking on the main toolbar. You'll see all these different options to open up different toolbars, and then one of them being the axis constraint toolbar. I can choose it, and now I have a floating toolbar with my axis constraints on it. I could right-click on this toolbar title area, or actually any toolbar title area, and you'll receive the same flyout. From this flyout, I could dock it, say to the left. Now it's docked to the left. I can right-click on it again while it's docked over here and choose float. Or, if it's docked, let me dock it once again to the left side. And I can simply come over here, and I'm going to click and drag. I'm going to click right on the very top of the toolbar while it's docked to the left or the right, and you'll see my cursor's changing to this double layer icon. And as I click on it, I can then drag it out and just make it a floating toolbar. And then to close it, you just click on the X in the upper right corner. This is all basic Windows stuff. I can even drag the main toolbar out and have it be a floating toolbar. I can then have the ability to resize it and move it anywhere I want. I could also dock it to a different location, such as the left. And now you see it's docked along the left side. Then we can drag it out again, and it floats again. As I mentioned, this is the main toolbar, but there are actually many toolbars. Back in Release 3 of this program, the default interface actually displayed all the different toolbars that were available. And you can easily display all the different toolbars if you want by once again right-clicking on your main toolbar, and this time I'll just choose Tab Panel. The Tab Panel bars are now along the top. You can access different tab panels just by clicking on them. There's a tab panel for just about any action or command that you can perform within this program, whether it's from creating geometries, splines, applying modifiers, rendering, and so on. And of course, each of these toolbars can be dragged out to become floating toolbars. They can also be customized with different commands and icons. Using the right-click menus, they can be docked or removed from the tab panel and easily placed back on the tab panel. I'm going to close the tab panels, and let's return our main toolbar to the top docked position, back to our default position. So you can see there are all kinds of tools and buttons available within this program. And if you also hold your cursor over a button or a tool, that tool's name then would be displayed. So you can kind of get an idea of what each one of these are called or what they do. And as these videos progress, we're going to be learning about all the different buttons and the purpose for all these different buttons. As we just learned, the right of the screen, this is our command panel, which has 6 user interface panels to access a variety of different commands. You just click on the tab and that panel is then displayed. These panels are the Create panel, and this has all of our object and shape creation tools. I'll create a couple objects by activating a button, and then I'm just going to click and drag right in the viewport to create some basic geometry. Now the Modified panel has all of our modifiers, and it has our modifier stack. It has the modifier list and the editing tools and the parameters for a selected modifier. The Hierarchy panel has the links, the inverse kinematic parameters, and your pivot point controls. The Motion panel has your animation controls, your motion parameters for a selected object, or the object's trajectory controls. The Display panel allows you to hide and unhide, freeze, unfreeze different objects in your viewport. The Utility panel has a miscellaneous utilities such as the Asset Browser, the Collapse feature, Motion Capture utility, and much more. We'll be discussing all the different panels in greater detail as each lesson progresses. Along the bottom of the interface, there is a time slider and a track bar that allows you to navigate and edit your frames within your animation. Just under the time slider, to the left, there is a new icon or a button to access the curve editor. This is also new in this release of the track view. Not only is the curve editor new, but the way that you access it down here is new. More on that later. Right now, I just wanted to point out that this is where it was. It's located down here, docked on the lower part of your interface. Like I said, more on this later. For right now, let's just click the Close button and return back to our default layout. In the very lower left corner, you'll find the Max script area for creating custom commands in the program's built-in scripting language. Again, I want to remind you that my screen resolution is set to 800 by 600. So these areas are very crowded down here right now, but at a higher resolution, you would be able to see all these different sections very clearly. Right now, it's just a little cramped down here. Like the status bar and the prompt line, which gives us information about our scene and the commands or actions. I can hardly even see them down here right now. Next to that, you have the lock selection button. To the right of that, you'll find the type-in transformation box on the status bar for entering precision transformations. Our animation and our time controls are next. If you've used previous versions of 3ds Max or you've ever seen it, you're probably going to notice this has changed quite a lot over here. Previous versions used to just have one animate button, and that was it. But now there's an auto key button, which replaces the animation button, and there's also a set of key mode buttons, the set key mode and the selection list and the key filter controls. More on all of this later. In case you are saying, hey, that looks different from previous, you're right, it has changed, and we're going to discuss that later. To the right of that, you're going to find your time controls. The time controls allow you to navigate through your animation frame by frame or keyframe by keyframe, and also play back your animation and watch it. One of the buttons down here, or icons, is the time configuration dialog box. You can also just right-click on any playback control and you'll receive the time configuration dialog box. So it's multiple ways of getting here. But in this dialog box, you can see we can set the frame rate for our animation, how time is displayed, the playback options, and I can also control the start, the end time, and the length of my animation, all from inside here. Let's close this and move on. And then the lower right corner, these are the final set of tools on the interface. These are your view navigation controls. And these buttons allow you to quickly navigate within individual or multiple viewports depending upon what tool you're using. These buttons will change also dependent upon which viewport is active, whether it be perspective, camera, light, top, bottom, so on. Some of them also have flyouts with them with further options, further viewing options. If you see this little black triangle in the lower right corner of an icon, this is telling you there's a flyout. And this is also true with any tools, whether it's on the main toolbar or wherever. If you see this little black triangle, that means there are multiple tools associated with that certain tool. Now, the main part of our user interface is obviously the viewports. You see 4 views in the default window. Each viewport displays the 3 axes that make up the 3D world, the Y, the X, and the Z axis. Each viewport has a viewport label in the upper left corner and telling you what type of viewport this is, and there's also an axis icon in the lower left corner. To activate a viewport, you simply just right-click on the viewport, and you'll see a yellow border appears around that viewport. This is telling you, here's the active viewport or the one you're currently working in. As we stated earlier, there's many different ways of performing the same task or accessing a tool within 3ds Max. A very efficient method is using what's called the quad menu. To access the quad menu, just right-click in a viewport or on an object, and the quad menu will appear. Depending upon what you are right-clicking on, will control which quad menu will appear. It's content sensitive to what you're right-clicking on. Very efficient. But you can see I can access a variety of different commands and actions very quickly from the quad menu, such as my transformation tools. I don't need to go to the main toolbar to get the move or the rotate or the scale tool. I can just right-click and here they are. I can switch back and forth very quickly. Let's go back to our viewports themselves. There's a couple more things I want to point out. If I place my cursor in between the viewports, I can click and drag and I can resize these viewports. I can make this one viewport very large and decrease the size of the other 3. And to reset my viewport back to its original, I can just right-click in between any viewport here and choose the reset layout. And by doing that, my viewports all go back to their default layout. Now you can access viewing information and options such as how the objects in the viewport will be displayed by right-clicking on the viewport's name in the upper left corner. I can choose Smooth and Highlighted, which is the default for a perspective viewport, or Wireframe, which is the default for the top, the left, and the front viewport. And then the F3 key, this is a very efficient hotkey to use because your active viewport will switch between a smooth and highlighted viewport or a wireframe viewport just by hitting the F3 key repeatedly. I'm going to right-click in the viewport label again, and you can choose from other options from the other flyout to view your objects as maybe just smooth mode or with no highlights, or facets with highlights, or just a bounding box. And you'll switch between these different view types depending upon what you are working on and the complexity of your scene in the viewport that you're working in. There's other options from the right-click menu, such as View Edge Faces. This is very helpful when you're modeling and you want to actually see the edge faces in your viewport. The hotkey for this feature is the F4 key. And then there's a series of other viewing options below that, such as showing the grid or not showing the grid in a viewport. The letter G on your keyboard is a toggle for this, a hotkey for this, so you can turn the grid on and off very easily. You can turn on edge faces with the F4 key. You can switch back and forth from a shaded viewport to a wireframe viewport with F3. So you can see how these hotkeys can really help you quickly control how objects are viewed in your viewport. Another viewport option from the right-click menu is the Show Background. Now, we don't have a background image right now, but if we did, this is where you can turn the visibility of that background on and off. And then there's the Show Safe Frame toggle for turning on and off the safe frame area or safe zones. The hotkey for this is hold the Shift key and hit the F key. This will turn this on and off. Then below that is the Viewport Clipping options, which allows you to set a near and a far view range in your viewport. We'll take a look at this later. And there's also the texture correction option. You have to be in a shaded viewport for this option to do anything, first of all. And what it's going to do is redraw the viewport with pixel interpolation to correctly display any maps that are being displayed. The hotkey for the texture correction is hold the Control key and hit the T key, Control T. Now this is a software-driven driver feature. And what I mean by that, if you are using a video card that is using OpenGL, or you're using the OpenGL feature of a video card, or the Direct 3D display card, this option is always on. You don't have to worry about it. It's always going to be on. There's the Disable Viewport option. Use this to speed up your screen redraws. What this does is, let's say I disable the Perspective viewport. Now, the viewport label reads Perspective/disabled. If I activate the top viewport, look again at your Perspective viewport, and you're going to see the center reads inactive. So you know this viewport is disabled. In the top viewport, if I transform any objects, I get the Move tool, and I start moving an object around in the top viewport, you're going to see the transformation is being updated in my other viewports, but not in the Perspective viewport. This is because it's disabled. But when I right-click in the Perspective viewport to make it current again, it will update with any changes that I made in other viewports, such as the top viewport. So it speeds up your redraw of the current viewport you're working in because it doesn't have to redraw what's in the disabled viewport until you activate it. Then it would update it. Now the hotkey to toggle an active viewport to be a disabled or not disabled is your letter D on the keyboard. So disabled D, pretty easy one to remember. So make sure your Perspective viewport is active again and hit the D key if you need to make sure it is not disabled. And now if I go back to the top viewport and I start to move an object again, you'll see our Perspective viewport is updating in real time again. Next on the viewport right-click menu, the next option, you'll see a flyout. And this flyout has a list of all the different types of views a viewport can be. By default, we've got our 4 viewports. We have the top, the front, the left, and a perspective. You can change any viewport to be a right view, or the bottom view of your scene, or the back view, and so on. Just choose one from the list, and then that viewport would change. And there's also hotkeys for several different types of viewports. For example, the letter P on your keyboard is a Perspective viewport. If you activate any viewport and you hit the letter P, that then is Perspective viewport. And the letter F is a front viewport. The letter L is a left viewport. The letter B is a bottom viewport. You get the idea. The right view and the back view by default do not have hotkeys, but a little bit later we're going to just look at how you can create custom keyboard shortcuts and stuff. So you can actually go and customize it and make the right or the back viewport have hotkeys if you wanted to. We're going to stick with the default hotkeys. We'll talk about that later, though. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I also would like to mention that when we add cameras or lights in our scene, we can actually have a viewport display what the camera view is, or the light view. If you have a target spotlight, we can actually look at what that target spotlight is looking at through the viewport. Those objects, the lights and the cameras, would then be available from this right-click menu. Right now they're not because we don't have any. But again, later on. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now you can use a viewport for other purposes or reasons than just viewing your geometry and your scene. Back in the right-click menu, at the bottom, you'll see some other options such as active shade or schematic, grid, extended, and shape. These types of viewports probably mean nothing to you right now, and we'll discuss them later, but I just wanted to point out that this is where you would access some of these things. In fact, many of the preference and options that we're going to be going over right now might not make any sense until we get a little deeper into this program. So if I'm breezing over them, don't feel like, oh, you're not covering this well enough. We're going to go over all these different options, but when it's more relevant to you to understand it properly. Right now, I'm kind of just giving you an introduction to the interface so you know where all this stuff is, okay, and what it basically does. There's also a viewport configuration dialog box that has other options for your viewports, and you can access it in different ways. One way is to right-click on a viewport label, and at the bottom I can choose Config. And then here I receive the viewport configuration dialog box. Let me close this for right now just to show you the other way of accessing it, which is from the Customize drop-down menu along the top here. I go here and I can just come down and choose viewport configuration, and here it is again. In this dialog box we have 5 different sections, 5 different tabs to access the different categories of controlling our viewports. The rendering method, the layout, the safe frames, the adaptive degradation, and the region category. Let's go back to our rendering method first. And you're going to see many of the same options that you saw when you right-clicked on your viewport to receive that flyout. You're going to see many of the same options there are here, such as how an object is displayed in the viewport and what rendering level is it at. Will it be smooth and highlighted, or facets and wireframe, etc. And below, you're going to find the texture correction options. There's the viewport clipping options. But there's also some options that are not available from your right-click method, such as the disabled textures or the default lights option. In the lower left, you have control whether the changes you are making in the rendering method panel here apply to the current active viewport, all viewports, or all viewports except the active viewport. Let's go over to the Layout tab now. So we click on it, and here you're going to see 14 different possible layouts. Just pick one, and you click OK at the bottom. The dialog box will close, and the layout will be the current layout. I'm going to go back to the Viewport Configuration dialog box, and let's just choose another layout randomly. Just pick any one, and then apply this one too. Let's go back, and let's set our default back up, the original one. Click the Safe Frames tab, and here you control the safe frames that are displayed in your viewport by a percentage of reduction of the viewport size. There's a standard live area, there's the action safe area, the title safe area, plus one name user safe, which is great if you have a certain area that needs to be displayed in the viewport for a specific reason or a specific job. There's also the 12 field grid options for displaying grids of cells in your viewport. In the lower left, you can turn your safe zones on and off for the active viewport. Next, let's go to the Adaptive Degradation tab. Now, bear with me here because this sounds more confusing than it is. What might seem confusing is that by default, the adaptive degradation is off. You have to manually turn it on to use all these settings in here. But there's a good reason for that, and that is the best scenario is you don't have to use adaptive degradation. So let me explain what adaptive degradation does. It dramatically drops your rendering level in a shaded viewport based on the display performance of what your graphic card can show you. Adaptive degradation takes effect when you're working in your shaded viewport, not in wireframes, only in a shaded viewport. So in a shaded viewport, as I'm transforming objects, I'm changing my view or playing back my animation. If my scene is too complex for my graphic card, the 3ds Max will display these objects as wireframe objects or even maybe just a bounding box according to what the settings are in this dialog box, so that your playback and your redraw in your viewport will be in real time. Here is where you control the adaptive degradation settings, meaning how the objects in the viewport will be displayed when your graphic card can't maintain the real-time playback or the redraw. Like I said, by default, you are not using adaptive degradation. Playback in a shaded viewport will always play back your animation the best that it can while maintaining the object's display quality at the highest level. Now this means no matter how complex the scene is, the viewport will always show the objects in their shaded form. Again, this is the default. But if your scene is too complex to play back in real time, the playback will then become jerky and frames will start to be dropped. It is then that you should turn on adaptive degradation. You can do this from the View drop-down menu. That's where you'll find the option toggle. See, here it reads Adaptive Degradation. Or you can use the hotkey for the toggle, which is the letter O on your keyboard. If there's a check to the right, you are using adaptive degradation. If there is no check, then adaptive degradation feature is off. When there's a check next to adaptive degradation, then you can watch the animation in real time, but your objects will be displayed according to the settings on the adaptive degradation control panel. Now the last tab is the region controls, and later we'll learn about rendering. Just know that you can render a region of your scene or a blown up section of your scene instead of rendering the entire view of your scene. So if you wanted to just render a certain part or a zoomed in area, you can use these controls to do so. So you have lots of control over your viewports. You also have a lot of control over the interface by going to the Customize drop-down menu along the top, and your first option you're going to see is the Customize User Interface. In this dialog box, I can customize everything from my keyboard shortcuts, the toolbars, the quad menus, the menus themselves, the colors of everything in my interface. You have all the control you can possibly ever want. You can then save just the keyboard shortcuts if you wanted, or your customized toolbars if you wanted, or the quads or the menus or the color schemes that you created and load them later. You also can save the user interface as a whole with all the options that you've customized for, say, a different artist or even a different project that you're working on. You do this by making your changes, and then from the Customize menu again, I'll choose Save Custom UI Scheme. Now in this dialog box, I can name my Customize UI and save it. And then we can load it later from the same Customize menu. Or I can take it with me and load it on another workstation. Now, if another artist was to use my station or use your station, he or she can then save and load their own custom interface that best suits their needs or their job. So this is really versatile. There are several saved user interfaces that come default with 3ds Studio Max. I'm going to load a couple of these. Let's just experiment. I want to show you just how much control you have over your interface. So let's load the discrete dark. I like this one. And now, as this UI will load, it's going to take a couple seconds. And the icons need to be updated. But once it does open, you're going to see this very cool dark scheme and all these new icons, all these new buttons. Let's set it back to the default. Again, it's going to take a couple seconds. And also, whenever a new release of Max is released, they generally include the previous version's interface. So if you worked in release 4 of 3ds Max and you really liked it, you could then load the 3ds Max R4 interface from the load menu. Again, it's going to take a couple seconds. But now I have the release 4 interface that I can work with. The first thing you're going to notice is that there's this floating toolbar here for the snaps control. Now that's because in release 4, these controls were actually along the bottom of our viewport, and now in release 5, they're on the top of the toolbar. Oh, and notice this button. It's the adaptive degradation toggle button. In release 4, you actually had a button that you could use at the bottom of your interface to toggle it on and off. Now in Release 5, we go to the View menu, drop-down menu, or we use the hotkey of letter O, which is pretty easy. Anyways, let's set this back to our default. As we said earlier, we're definitely going to be working in the default interface that came with Release 5 throughout all these lessons. And we're going to use all the default hotkeys. Very often I'm going to ask you to reset 3ds Max. You do this by going to the File menu and you choose Reset from the menu. This option resets all the settings and the data back to the startup of this program, as if you just rebooted it. You will be asked to save your scene if you made any changes to it, and you'll also be asked to confirm that you really do want to reset the program. Oh, and before we go any further, I want to show you how to access that splash screen that first opened up when we first opened the program with all the different hotkeys that come default with 3ds Max 5. Go to the Help drop-down menu and choose Hotkey Map. Now I received the splash screen, and I can move my cursor over the different keys in this little keyboard graphic down here, and the hotkeys associated with those selected keys will then be displayed. You can also click on the triangle in the lower right corner to step through each different hotkey grouping the way they have it laid out here. Now there are many hotkeys in this program, and I'm going to try to mention as many as possible as we progress. But remember, to review them, you can come here and check them out, or you can actually go on the online help and you can print out a list of the default hotkeys for all the different sections of 3ds Max. It's very cool. I really like this little splash screen here. It's very handy. One more important point to make: if you have used earlier versions of Max, make sure to take note that a lot of the default hotkeys have changed since Release 4 into Release 5. There are some big changes, so keep note of that. So that's why this new interface, this new splash screen, is really handy. So if you're familiar with different hotkeys, some things have definitely been changed. Okay, let's go back to the command panel. I want to look at its options and its layout features and how you navigate around in the command panel. By right-clicking along the top, or just to the right of the Utilities tab here, that's the hammer icon on the far right, I can access options for the command panel. You can make the command panel float, or you can have it docked either side, left or right, whichever one you want. Default is right. Now, each of these panels comes with its own set of subcategories, list, and rollouts. And you'll use these plus and minus signs in this little bar here with the name of that rollout to expand and collapse the rollouts. You can also scroll up and down using a small hand that will appear in the empty space of the rollout, and you can scroll up and down with the scroll bar on the right side also. By right-clicking on the edge of the rollouts, you'll receive options for the rollouts, such as open all rollouts or collapse all rollouts, or you can easily jump to a certain rollout by choosing its name in this menu. You can also expand the width of the command panel by clicking and dragging on this inside edge here by the viewports, and as drag it out, and I can allow multiple columns for my rollouts so I can see and access more panels and rollouts at one time. To return the command panel back, you just click and drag on the edge again and just drag it back the other way. You can also rearrange the order of the rollouts within here. So if I simply just click on the rollout title bar and I start dragging it, I can just drag it to a new position. So now you know how to navigate and work around in the command panel. Let's make sure that the Create panel is active. It's the first one on the left. And the Create panel has a series of categories you can access with these category buttons. There are 7 different Create categories, such as geometry, shapes, lights, cameras, and so on. Some of these categories will have subcategories that you access from the subcategory drop-down menu. For example, make sure your current panel is the Create panel and the category is geometry, and your subcategory is standard primitives. I can easily choose a different subcategory from the list, such as extended primitives, and now I receive a whole different set of creation buttons, different shapes that I can create. I could also choose the compound objects, particle systems, dynamic objects, and each time the button and the options below will change on the Create panel. Make sure that you are at the Geometry section, and our sub-selection drop-down menu is Standard Primitives. Here you see a variety of different standard shape geometries that we can create. I'm going to activate the box button, and then the box creation parameters appear on the Create panel. The box is indented. It changes to yellow just to make sure you know it's active. And the most basic way to create geometry is to simply just click and drag in the viewport. When you're creating a box, I click and drag to start the creation, continue dragging while holding down the mouse button. I'm defining the first parameters of the box, and I can watch the parameters roll out. Now, it's kind of hard to see on my resolution, but on your resolution, you'll see the parameters roll out on the Create panel, so you can view the measurements to help you as you create your first two dimensions. And once I'm set, I can release the mouse button, and now I can move up and down to create the final parameter of the box. Once I'm satisfied, I click once more to end the creation process. After you've created an object or a shape, that object is still selected. You are still in the creation process of this object. At this point, you can change the parameters of your object on the Create panel under the Parameters rollout. Once you start to perform another task or get another tool, you can only change the parameters of an existing object on the Modify panel, because you are technically modifying an existing object. But until I exit the creation mode, until I deselect it or I get another tool, I'm still creating this box. So if I wanted to, I could enter an amount of the dimensions on the Create panel, hit the Enter key, and then that would alter the creation of the box. Notice that the box button is still active because we haven't exited the creation method yet. But watch the box button and the Create panel. When I right-click in the viewport, this ends the creation mode. And then, to modify this existing box, to modify its parameters, I have to have it selected, and I go to the Modify panel. Okay, back on the Create panel. Let's activate the box again. And when you're creating a box, you have two creation methods on the Create panel to choose from. There's the box mode, which we just used, and there's also the cube mode. If I switch to the cube mode, and then I go and I click and drag in the viewport, a symmetrical box or cube is created with just one click and drag to determine its size. All dimensions are set to the same. I right-click to end the creation method, and I now receive the previous tool that I had active before I started creating this box. And you delete objects by simply obviously selecting them and hitting the delete key on your keyboard. I'm going to switch back to box mode to show you another way of creating geometry using what's called the keyboard entry rollout. First, let me expand this rollout. And now here you can see we can enter all the dimensions. We can enter the length, the width, and the height that we want this box to be. I can also enter the axis coordinates to where I want this box to be created at. And then when you click the Create button, the box is then created according to the parameters that you set in this rollout. I'm going to continue and just create a couple different geometry just so you get a sample of what these are. You should experiment with these. Let's create a sphere. You can also create a torus by clicking and dragging, or use your keyboard entry rollout if you want. Let's go and choose the extended primitives from our drop-down list for some more complex geometry that we can create. We looked at this briefly earlier. And the amount of clicks and drags that you'll use to create an object is going to depend upon the object that you're creating. Like I said, you should take some time and experiment with each different type of standard or extended primitives and their creation methods. Also, if you would like a written information about each type of object that you can create and the creation method, refer to your online help. Now, every object that we're creating is created on what is known as a home grid. And the home grids are these three planes that intersect a common point that make up the origin of 3D space, the 3D world. The intersection occurs along these three lines. That's the X, the Y, and the Z axis coordinates. In each viewport, you can see all three axes. The grid that is flat to you is one axis home grid, and the dark lines that cross within this grid, these are the other two. So depending upon which viewport is active and which viewport you are working in, this determines what axis home grid you are creating your objects and your shapes on. As you create and build a scene, to help you stay organized, it's a very, very good habit to get into naming your objects right away. Now, 3ds Max will give each object a default name and a number extension dependent upon the quantity of the certain object that you create. So if you create 12 boxes, you'll then have a box named Box 01 and all the way up to Box 12. And when you need to select one of these boxes by name, it's going to get quite confusing because you're not going to be sure which box was created when and what number. So naming your objects is very important, and it's very easy. You just select the object, you click in the name field on the command panel, and then you can type in the name that you wish. That's it. So naming your objects help you organize your scene, but so does the color that the objects appear in the viewport. And you can control what display color the object is in the viewport by just clicking on this color square next to the name field. The color you choose in this dialog box will control the color of the wireframe or the shaded object that is in your viewport. And these are there for viewing purposes only, not for rendering. But you can choose any color, or you can even create a custom color if you needed to. You can also have objects the same color, or you can have 3ds Max randomly choose the color of each object as you create them. If I click the Assign Random Color in the lower left corner of this dialog box, this toggles the option on and off. When the feature is on with a check mark, each object you create will be a random color chosen by 3ds Max. With this option off, no check mark, each object will then be the color that you last chose from this dialog box. Click on a color to choose it. So if I'm creating a room and I want all the walls to be one color, I can do that. And then if I want the floor to be another color, and I want furniture or windows, so you get full control over this to help you stay organized as you build your scene. As I said earlier, the default tool that is active with 3ds Max first opens is the Select tool. You obviously use this tool to select objects and multiple objects. Now the key thing about this tool is that no transformation is performed while you use this tool to select objects. To transform objects, you need to use one of the Select and Transformation tools. To move an object, you activate the Select and Move tool, and then you select the object, and the Transform gizmo appears. Again, if you've used earlier versions of 3ds Max, you're going to see some changes on this transformation gizmo. More on the scale and the rotate transformation gizmo, but there are some changes also on the move transformation gizmo. But let's start talking about it. First thing you're going to notice is that you have handles that represent each of the three axes. And you use the Select and Move tool to move objects, obviously. But if I click on just one of these axes arrows, I am now constraining my object's movement to that axis. You can also move an object in multiple axes in a viewport by clicking and dragging on this plane or the different planes you'll see in a perspective viewport. Just by clicking on this area and then you drag around, I can move on two axes at once instead of just one. We'll discuss all the transformation tools in great depth later, but right now I just want to introduce you to some of the tools before we move on. You know you can access the transformation tools from the main toolbar, or we can use the quad menu to access these tools, plus much more from the quad menu. Remember, to access the quad menu, we just right-click in a viewport, and depending on what we are right-clicking on or what task we are performing or command we're performing, you'll receive either a 2 section of the quad menu or all 4 sections of the quad menu. The quad menus you receive will always be relevant to what you are doing and what you are clicking on. In the transform section, this lower quad here, I can access each one of the transformation tools, whether it's the move tool, rotate tool, or the scale tool. So I don't have to go back to the toolbar every time I want to change to another transformation tool. I can just right-click and very quickly I can access them. There's also hotkeys to access these transformation tools. The W key is your move tool. The E key is the rotate tool, and the R key is the scale tool, all right in a row, W-E-R. Let's create another shape. Let's create a cylinder. So I click the cylinder button, and to create a cylinder, we do it just like we do with a box. You basically start to click and drag to set the radius of the cylinder, and then when I release the mouse and I raise up and down, I can set the height. And when I'm happy, I'm satisfied, I just click and I end the process. Now don't deselect the cylinder yet. Look at the parameters rollout, and I want you to notice the height segment. The height segments are set to 5 right now. And look at the cylinder in a wireframe viewport, and you'll see there's 5 rows of segments for running up the side of this thing, for the height of it. Back on the parameters rollout, change the height segments to 20. And then you'll see 20 rows of segments in the cylinder. The more segments an object has, the more flexibility the object will be. But this also will increase your render and the complexity of your scene. Select and delete all the objects that you've created except for this cylinder. Let's just leave the cylinder here for right now. I want to quickly introduce you to a couple of the view navigation tools. First, the zoom tool. Now it looks like the magnifying glass icon, and when I select it, I can now just click and drag up and down in the viewport to zoom in and out. The hotkey for zooming in and out are the left open bracket and the right open bracket keys. Your left open bracket will zoom you in, and the right open bracket will zoom you out. The other view tool I'd like to introduce you to right now is called the Arc Rotate tool. It's the second button from the right on the bottom row. Make sure the active viewport is the perspective viewport, and then activate the Arc Rotate tool. And you'll notice a yellow circle with 4 control points appears in the viewport. For now, I just want to let you know that if I click and drag within this yellow circle, I can rotate my view. I can also use the control points to constrain the rotation in different directions. We'll discuss and learn all the different view navigation tools as each lesson progresses on. Now let's start creating 2D shapes using splines. So back on our command panel, I want to be at the Create panel, and I'm going to click the Shapes button. It's the second button from the left. So now we are in the Shape category of the Create panel. I'll activate the Circle button, and in the top viewport, I'll just click and drag to create a circle shape. As with geometry, all the shapes that you create are being created on the home grid. And you can also adjust the parameters of an object that you create while it's still in creation mode on the Create panel. But as soon as you start another command or you get a different tool, you will need to go to the Modify panel to access the shape's parameters. Let's just keep creating shapes in the different viewports to experiment with some of these shapes. And you'll notice that each one is being created on the axis home grid of that viewport. I'm going to get the Arc Rotate tool in the perspective viewport, and we can rotate around. You can see these are all these different shapes that were created either in the top, the front, or the left viewport. And depending upon which one they were created in, you can see that is the home axis grid they're on. You also control the color and the names of all the shapes you create, just like you did with geometry. Now that we've learned how to create objects and shapes, you can alter your objects and shapes by applying modifiers to them. Select the cylinder, and let's go to the Modify panel. You'll notice on the Modify panel that the name and the color fields for the selected object is located on the top of the Modify panel. Under that, you'll find the modifier list and the modifier stack. When you select an object, the modifier stack is an accumulative history of that selected object and any modifiers that you've applied to this object. Right now there's only a cylinder in the stack, and below that we have the parameters for the creation of this cylinder. And these parameters will change, these rollouts down here will change depending upon what you select in the modifier stack, whether it's a modifier or the actual object. But right now, I can still alter the parameters of this existing geometry or the splines if I needed to on the modifier panel. Go back to our modifier list up here. I'm going to click on this arrow, and now I get a list of every modifier available. Now, this screen resolution is really bad for displaying the modifier list, as you can see. But at a normal screen resolution, normal setting of 1024 by 726 or even higher, you would see a full list of all the modifiers available instead of just this little box that's opening up here for me. Anyways, as I scroll through the list, I can see there are quite a few modifiers that can be applied. The default for the list is to be broken into 3 different groups. The top group is the selection modifiers. This is by default the top. And then there's the world space modifiers. And finally, underneath that, there are the object space modifiers. And each group is listed alphabetically. You can change the way the list and the modifiers are displayed by going to the Configure Modifier Set button and clicking on it, and I'm going to receive a flyout. You can access this same flyout by right-clicking on the list arrow, this little arrow up here. I right-click on that, I get this same flyout. The third choice down in this flyout, you see it says Show All Sets in List option. If I place a check next to it by clicking on it, I'll be activating this option. Now if I expand the list, you're going to see all the modifiers are broken into different modifier sets, such as patch and spline editing, mesh editing, animation modifiers, and so on. Now, I personally like the default list. I like it where they're in alphabetical order. It's easier for me to access modifiers. That's just my choice, though. So I'm going to go back and remove that check from Show All Sets in List to go back to the default. And as we said, with the default setting, we have 3 different groups of modifiers. The world space modifiers, the object space modifiers, and the top one being the selection modifiers. We'll discuss the difference between the two, the world and the object space, a little later. For now, just know you can control which set appears on this top up here. Back on that configure modifier list, go to that flyout again, and you'll see a list of all the predefined modifier sets that came default with 3ds Max 5. The top one being the selection set. And you'll see a little marker to the left of that name. This is indicating that this set will appear on the top of the modifier list in alphabetical order. If I click on the UV coordinate modifier list from this flyout, now we go back to the list. The top modifier set that is available to me is the UV coordinate modifier set. It's above the world and the object space sets. So you can choose which set you want to be that first one from your list. You have control over that. Again, if you ever used earlier versions, actually you have to go back to either release 2 or release 3, you would have seen buttons that were available for your modifiers. Well, actually, like I said, they were removed on release 4. You can choose whether or not to view modifier button sets from the Configure Modifier Set menu. You can also create custom button sets. I don't want to spend a great deal of time on the modifier stack yet. We're going to be spending a lot of time later, but I need to know that you have a good feeling and a good understanding of how this works. So we'll spend more time on this later. For now, let's just apply a modifier to the cylinder. So with the cylinder selected, we can see it in the stack. We now have access to all of the cylinder's creation parameters below, right? From the modifier list, I can click on any modifier, let's say a taper modifier. Another very efficient tip, this is why I like the alphabetical order. When you have the list expanded, all I need to do is hit the letter T on my keyboard, and all the modifier list will jump to the first modifier that starts with the letter T. And then I can just continue to press the letter T, and the modifier list will cycle through all the modifiers starting with the letter T. Whether it's in the world space, the object space modifier, this is very helpful. And once the taper modifier is selected, I can just click on it, and now the list closes and the modifier is applied to our selected object, the cylinder. If you look at the modifier stack, now you'll see the taper modifier is on top of the cylinder. And the taper modifier, being that it's selected in the stack, now the taper parameters are now available below in the rollouts. In the viewport, you can see this orange outline box around the cylinder. This is the taper modifier. The modifiers are objects that are placed on top of the original objects or the original shapes that you're applying them to. They do not render themselves, but they will alter and modify the shape or the object that you've applied it to. If I adjust the amount and the curve using the sliders of the parameters, the cylinder is then modified. You can apply multiple modifiers to a single object. You just keep adding them on top of each other. Let's apply another modifier. This time, let's go to the drop-down menu along the top here and go to the modifiers drop-down menu. And here you see a list of all the different categories. Each one will have the same modifiers available that we saw from the list. I'm going to go to the Parametric Deformers flyout, and from this flyout, let's choose the bend modifier. And now a bend modifier is on top of the stack. It's the last thing that was added, so it's on top of the taper and the cylinder. I can adjust the angle of the bend now, and it changes the direction of the cylinder, the way it's being bent. Now, if I needed to adjust the taper modifier again, I would just select it in the stack, and its parameters are available to me once again on the rollouts. I'm back with the taper parameters now. I can now adjust these taper parameters, and even if I needed to access the cylinder parameters, I could select that in the stack. And now I can adjust the radius or the height of the cylinder, and the modifiers on top are all being recalculated to this new cylinder parameters. Earlier we touched on segments of a geometry, the segments. If I decrease the height segments for the cylinder to 1, you can see how the modifiers applied to the cylinder don't really have too much effect to them because the geometry is not allowing it to. But if I slowly start to increase the amount of segments, you can see the modifier has more segments to work with. But by increasing the segments, we're also increasing the processing and the rendering time. Keep that in mind.